can ICE change? How do we transform ICE? Is it possible that under a Biden administration, its powers will be reined in? Is there the political will and appetite for that? And something I wonder is, it's often thrown around as a slogan that we should abolish ICE, but it seems to me that, the American sort of immigration enforcement complex is so deeply entrenched that the day ICE is abolished, there's probably going to be an equivalent organization under a different name that comes into being and operates to do much the same job. So what does the Biden administration mean for the potential of trying to curtail the power of this entity? And can it possibly be abolished? And what needs to happen in order for that to be materialized?
I'll start by saying
I think Sean wants to add something, but he's muted.
Oh. Go ahead.
There you
go. So I messed up the nice production there. No, I was just going to add. So the other part of the question is like, what does it mean like for African asylum seekers, for African, refugees, for African migrants? Like, is Trump? We asked this. As you remember, we asked this from Abraham too. Is Biden going to be better? Mm-hmm. African refugees? That's the second part, like I can hear you like you're like you don't sound convinced, or maybe I heard you wrong, but maybe you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah. It's a complicated question. I am part of a sort of really progressive left that does deeply believe that there is simply no alternative to a safe and equitable migration policy that does not include abolishing ICE. It is just simply impossible. And every day in our campaigns and in our work, that is first and foremost our goal, our ask, and our vision for immigration policy. With that said, having worked with dozens of Cameroonians over the last few months, I have become very aware of the real importance of small piecemeal reforms that allow, at the very least, the folks who are at the border, who are in detention centers, some reprieve. So, for example, I've been working with a group of advocates to ensure that Cameroon has temporary protected status, which is status given to eligible nations and countries who oftentimes come from countries that are in the midst of armed conflict or natural disasters, and allow folks from these designated countries to sort of live and work in the United States for a temporary amount of time. Now, this is not a permanent solution, but it is a solution that provides some relief and allows folks at the very least to not feel as though they are at risk of deportation and are not living in sort of endless precarity for years at a time. Getting and gaining TPS status for a country is virtually impossible. It has happened under the Trump administration, but I do believe is more likely to happen under a Biden administration. I think there may be some openness amongst the Democrats to do such a thing. So I think there are these sort of piecemeal reforms that are crucial. I do think that even in the case where Trump does not get elected over the next few months, we will see him amping and ramping up deportations of African migrants. So, best case scenario, Biden wins today, and we're still really screwed over the next few months because he still has the full authority to continue deporting folks from now until January. And so, a lot of us on the ground who are worrying about these issues are really just thinking piecemeal how to ensure folks are not getting deported between now and January and what to do about that. I think under the Biden administration, just judging from his campaign rhetoric, I don't see him making any, radical departure from Obama's policy. It will, I don't think we'll see the same images of family separation as we saw under the Trump presidency. But I think, William, as you were saying earlier, we're going back to normal, and normal was really what brought us here in the first place. So, I'm excited for the piecemeal work. I'm not so much optimistic for the sort of grand radical action that needs to happen to ensure that there is an actual material impact for folks on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and I'll add this to the question I wanted to ask, which is, what do those piecemeal reforms look like? Because I think something that reform can do is it could be a kind of a non-reform reform, which creates the space for democratic politics and for people to build power. And
Mhm.
then related to that is, how do immigrants build power so that they can assert their rights? So
Yeah.
Cameroonian asylum seekers on the southern US borders are often called the most organized.
Mhm.
So how are they organizing to defend their rights and freedoms? And how should the organized left sort of empower those efforts with this population of stateless people? How do we organize stateless people? What are the kind of non-reform reforms that we could push that makes the task of organizing them easier so that we can build the requisite power to get these dramatic changes?
Yeah.
And
Great
do
question.
we and do we and do we see those stateless people not as kind of in limbo, or
Mhm.
do we begin to see them as like this? It's a real thing. They there now. There's like a lot of these people. You know, they're not going anywhere.
Right.
They're not going to go home someday. So like,
Well, unless they're deported.
unless they deport it.
Even then, but yes.
Or they're in the case of Abram, where he says, I would like this and this and this. And then one day I might feel like I could go back to that place. But until then, these people are, sometimes people have been there since the 1960s.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So how does one organize? How does you as the left, as progressives, like what do you do when you see that?
Yeah. So you all threw a few questions at me. I'm going to try to see how to go about answering that.
This is kind of our fashion. We kind of like when you think you got it, we're like, nah, let's throw more. Let's throw more.
Yeah, we know nothing. We honestly know nothing. We literally bring people on the show because we're like, we're too lazy to read. Let's just invite some smart people and make them talk.
And let us ask them everything. Okay, so let me see. I'll start here. I think in terms of organizing and reform. So by and large, so much of the activism that's been happening in ICE detention is as a response to two things. One is because a lot of folks are receiving inadequate medical care, which really reflects a sort of broader pattern of medical bias against Black people in the United States. It's nothing new there. But what has happened over the last few weeks with the whistleblower story of the forced sterilizations, for example, and identifying the various Cameroonian women who were sterilized against their consent, some of whom were then attempted to be deported, though that did not work. But the lack of medical support for African migrants is, quite frankly, terrifying and horrifying. And in fact, a few folks have died in ICE custody over the last few years. And by few years, I mean 2 years or so. So this really is a fairly, I don't want to say new, but it's an exacerbating situation on the ground. The second reason why, by and large, folks are protesting is because Black migrants and Cameroonians and Haitians in particular are getting denied asylum and are getting denied bond and parole in ICE immigration courts at rates that far exceed almost any other country. So 86% of Haitians, for example, are denied asylum in the United States. 59% of Somalis are denied asylum in the United States. I mean, these are really, really harrowing numbers of African migrants who have been denied their asylum, and then even scarier numbers for bond and parole exists for African migrants. So when thinking about these two issues, I think there is a sort of immediate need there. I think folks need immediate medical care. That is a call of action that I think is narrow, is discreet, but really gets at the heart of what folks in these detention centers need, just as an immediate and material thing and call to action. I think the second is a bit harder around how do we ensure that the denial rates for asylum and bond and parole is not as high. I think some of that depends frankly, on a kind of media narrative campaign. I think judges maybe, and I don't proclaim to speak on behalf of all judges denying Cameroonians or all Black migrants at that, but I think there's a kind of ignorance around what is happening in Cameroon. We live in a country where the president calls all African countries shithole countries. I think that leads to a sort of public consciousness that suggests that Africa is one big conglomerate that is really, there's no one country that is struggling more than the other. If you let the Cameroonians in, we may have to let everyone in. And so I think what we're trying to do now is to ensure that while we're talking about Black migrants as a collective, because we do see patterns that impact Black migrants as a collective, we also don't conflate all African countries. What's happening in Cameroon is urgent. It is escalating, and we need to get folks understanding just how dangerous it is for folks who are fleeing the country. And I don't think that is sort of resonating with a lot of folks just yet. So there's a narrative piece to it. And, not just of judges, but I think the public consciousness, American public consciousness more generally, is just unaware of these things. That doesn't say a lot, but yes, it's true.